My first time doing an over-the-phone webinar. I don't know if you can see my little phone symbol. I haven't been smart enough to get a headset, so I hope that my left hand and right hand work in the correct order as we go through today. I also understand that the muting issue will block out any noise. I hope that not to be the cause of it on my end. All is quiet here. What I've done is I've put numbers on the slides. I probably should have done them in reverse so you know how long I'm going to be droning on at you, but they go from 1 to 10. So if there's a specific question that you have, I suppose you can write down the number related to the slide, or at least when you thought of it, if that helps in question time. Well, I'll get started. Thanks for joining. Just quickly about EIE. We're based at Oxford Brookes University. We're a consultancy unit that's been around since 1998. Our remit is mainly resource efficiency as it relates to energy efficiency, waste, and water. I suppose the reason I'm doing effective environmental reporting presentation is it's one of the issues when we audit and give advice, that we're always trying to get our communication to be more effective and to understand what we're trying to get our audience to do. So hopefully I've done 9 other slides that you will find useful, thought-provoking, or just an interesting mirror to hold up to what you might be doing in your own jobs. So without further ado, let's see if this is going to work for me by advancing to the next slide. And if not, then we're all going to stare at the first slide here. Oh, there we go. There we go. It's all working. Right. Wow. Well, there we go. We've passed the second hurdle. You can hear my voice, hopefully, and see the slides. I suppose this report was this presentation was a little bit inspired by an article that I caught in The Guardian. To my shock, it was over a year ago now. I don't know if anyone else saw it at the time. I think it was entitled "Howlers and Omissions Exposed in a World of Corporate Responsibility." It was in The Guardian. It was based on an article or some research that came out of Leeds University by Dr. Ralph Varkemeyer. Basically, sounded quite interesting, really looked at a lot of sustainability reports from various corporations and so on. The article focused on shocking errors in terms of numbers in reporting. I think there was one organization that accounted for sulfur. That's why there's a pile of sulfur in this image here, amounting to about 4 times the actual amount of sulfur on planet Earth. So a couple of problems were involved. To me, though, the real question that this research raised was about are the details in these reports actually relevant to the audience? We'd all like our environmental reporting to cause a certain reaction from our audience, but I did wonder in all of this research whether they were getting at what needs to be got at. I don't know about you, but I don't know what 4 times the amount of sulfur on planet Earth actually is. So I wonder if I would have caught that mistake myself. So there you go. I'll happily send through a link. I was not brave enough to switch screens, etc., to this particular article. It's still on the Leeds University website and makes for some interesting reading if that's the sort of style reporting that you're interested in. Actually, today on the news, I don't know if anyone saw, I think it was on the BBC website, that the UNEP have just put out a report about climate change. It was about the number of parts per million that we're at and that we're nowhere near on target globally. An interesting point about the BBC article, a very short article, towards the end, it was quoting this UN report, and it said that it suggested that CO2 was at 390.9 parts per million based on this UN report. So I clicked on that report, and actually not sure if the word suggests was a correct word. It was actually saying that in fact their measurements are 390.9 parts per million. I think there's an issue, certainly in the media, which may not be relevant to this presentation, about how science is sometimes presented as opinion and vice versa. So something hopefully of a theme through the presentation today. So moving on, I just want to cover a few basic topics, and for some of you this may be old hat, and you may do this as a matter of course whenever you're putting together environmental reports. But hopefully in having a look at some of these topic areas, we can maybe find some thoughts that we haven't had yet. So I'll be talking about the report aims, the audience who might hopefully be reading the reports. For want of a better word, the style of how reports are written. I guess inevitably the data that reports present, and the other side of data, which is information. We'll talk a little bit about what possible formats there are now and how that may affect what's in the reports, and finally end on legacy, because it seemed like a good note to end on. And I promise there will be no images of the setting sun when we get to legacy. We'll just try and keep on time. This image here, do you know that anyone who's ever read an environmental report that you've been working on has had this reaction? Have you wanted this reaction? I suppose that the question that was in my mind was, does anyone actually read the recommendations in the reports that we write? And we spend a lot of time in the EIE office trying to connect with the various audience members that we have. I found myself wishing I could often write the kinds of reports that get this sort of reaction. And I don't know if it happens or whether you've had experience of that. But I think there's another question kind of hanging in the air here, which is what do you want the action or the reaction of your audience to be if you have any control over it? I can imagine universities in particular have a lot of different goals for why they might have an environmental report, where it might fit into the greater context of the university. And perhaps shock and awe is maybe not the right reaction as depicted here. But I do think it's worth at the start of considering what it is you're trying to achieve. Being informative is one thing, but I suppose, particularly where the environment is concerned, there's an opportunity to present actions or decisions to be made. So it's something to think about, again, if you have some control over the aims of the report. So looking at that a little bit more closely, there's lots and lots of different ways of dividing up our potential audience, and I suppose we don't always have control, particularly using the internet, as to who is reading reports that we might be writing. But I think it's very strongly connected to the aims of a report. So for the purposes of today, which is a general lunchtime presentation, I've got three categories here: instigators, participants, and the unengaged. So the image you're seeing is probably the best one associated with the first topic there, which is about instigators. So I'd use that phrase to describe any situation where you might be reporting back to a group of individuals, a committee, or perhaps people in your department or your team where you've already been working on a project together, or there has been some progress, some discussion. I suppose that's relevant in terms of what you have to think about in a report, because those people will know some of the details already. You don't necessarily need to give a huge amount of background information. You don't need to re-explain certain concepts, or you might not need to, depending on what kind of people are involved in that. And also, I think specific goals may have already been decided in many cases where you're working closely, so your report can focus more quickly on specific details and so on. Contrast that with a situation where your audience might be somewhat in participation, but maybe not along for the whole ride. So as you can imagine in this image here, perhaps people who participated in a survey of some kind, or had an opportunity to give their opinions that led to the report being made. So there's perhaps a certain willingness of these participants to have been involved, but or perhaps they voiced opinions, but maybe they don't have the same level of knowledge as it would happen in bigger projects where you're working on a committee. Maybe some basic concepts that we work with every day need to be explained. Certainly acronyms, you have to be very careful that they're stated out loud. And I think two, there's some degree, I know when I've been asked to participate in something, I don't always have the full context. I don't know where people are going with this. I don't know if the report is the end point, the middle point, or just the beginning point of a larger project. So I think that's important to keep in mind when you have that type of an audience. And the last, and perhaps I was being a bit facetious with this name, is the unengaged. Certainly we feel we're often dealing with an audience that could be described as that. The best example I could think of is perhaps if you've been invited to go to a conference and present something, a report from your own universities perhaps, where you don't quite know who's going to be in the audience. You can suspect there will be people who do similar things to you and don't need too much explanation. However, there might be people who've just come in, maybe they've come into the wrong conference, who knows, and they don't have the full picture. I think that's where it's really important in environmental reporting to make sure that the aims and the whole report is engaging in some way and can relate to that audience. And it can be quite difficult if you don't know. So I guess the point of this slide is to try and learn a little bit about the audience as much as can be to preempt some of what may take up more space than you might want it to. Some background information or some context that helps people stay engaged with the subject material. Right. Well, moving on to the next idea here. I am, as part of my location at Oxford Brookes, I have some contact with students, and I've been teaching on an environmental management module for, I think this is my 6th year doing it, and there's an essay which I dread handing out every year. And I always tell the students that the thing about an essay is it's like wearing a tuxedo. Or a ball gown, I suppose, or both. It's about how you present yourself. It's as formal as it can be. And I suppose a lot of academic writing is very precise and formal, and its entire purpose is to not be misunderstood. On the other end of that spectrum, potentially, and I'm sure we've all seen examples of this in media more often than we would like, is well, I use the term rhetoric. I don't mean rhetoric as in a rhetorical question, but just kind of like a politician's speech that uses all kinds of devices in it to engender connection with the audience, and not necessarily bad tools at all, imagery or analogy or whatever it might be. However, I think when these two cross over, it can be it can confuse the audience a little. I think they're on a spectrum, and it may be something to consider when a report's being put together. A quote from a consultant's recent report about financial goals for a large charity was using a phrase something along the lines of realigning our direction of travel, which I would call a very rhetorical style phrase that can easily stray into meaningless if it's not used correctly. I don't think there's anything wrong with using report formats to engender an emotional response. The environment often is a very emotional topic and can be, and it all depends on what the goals are. I just think the writers need to be aware of these different styles, and there are many different styles of writing, but I thought I'd point out those two. The second I think I've alluded to here is level of detail. I was reading a report from a university in the United States where they were providing progress on some of their action points from presumably a year before in terms of the environment. And there were lots of things to cover in the report, which is always a difficult constraint. But the level of detail I found to be a bit shocking for something that was available publicly on the internet because it was very confusing. But fair enough, it may have been well understood. So there were examples of things like we are installing low flush toilets where possible. In itself, that's not a particularly wrong thing to do, but you can imagine if somebody doesn't understand A, what a low flush toilet is, or B, what exactly is meant by where possible, that it may raise more questions than it then it helps in terms of reporting. So I think the level of detail is important, and we're all pressed for time, and it's very difficult to take pages and pages to explain things. In fact, who would want that? We all like succinctness. However, I think there are certain key elements in environmental reports that need to have a level of detail, or at least an appendix or further information where the audience may get very confused or at least have more questions. However, on the other hand, I think if your report's purpose is to create questions and discussions, then perhaps some bullet points or some vague statements are maybe deliberately put in there for that purpose. The last point I wanted to make on style is about comparison. It's really difficult when we find ourselves, for example, under energy, working with an organization that has never measured their annual energy use to convert that into carbon equivalent or something. It is a relatively meaningless number unless you're comparing it either to year-on-year progression, so you can say we're more or less, or to some kind of national benchmark. Further education, I think, is a little bit further along that route in that there are benchmarks, but again, they may not always be that relevant depending on how it's been calculated and so on. I do think it's a really strong element of report to have a comparative element to how the style is written. However, I think it needs to be used very carefully, which I'll expand on in the next slide. The next slide is probably one of the more contentious, certainly in what's out there in regards to environmental reporting. If you think back to that Guardian article, a lot of its criticism in the Leeds reports about how corporations are reporting is about inaccuracies of information. Another point that was made out is that certain details were provided while others were just completely avoided. So I think it's worth talking about this subject. I guess some of the issues are the units, where I think it's important for consistency throughout a report and appropriately chosen units. So I've read reports from DEC and other government agencies where they have switched in the middle of the report from CO2 to CO2 equivalent and don't seem to know the difference between the two. So that really undermines the value of a report like that, where the units have been inconsistent. Similarly, I've seen energy audit reports where kilowatt hours and kilowatts get confused or seem to change. Again, it might be a typo, or it might be just a serious misunderstanding. I think that puts a lot of onus on people in environmental roles at universities who may be gathering a lot of data from a lot of different sources and be reliant on a lot of other staff members to not only correctly gather the data, but to provide it in a way that you don't have to recheck it. So it's a difficult issue to avoid, but I certainly think there's something in this that needs a bit of scrutiny when time allows, particularly for some of the units that we maybe aren't used to trading in. If for example, it's particular pollutants or something, to just make sure that we're on the right track with that. I guess accuracy is another obvious topic. I don't know what to say on this. It's very difficult. Certain devices make measurements for us, and it would be hard to catch if those devices were faulty without some kind of scrutiny. I know a local solicitor who works with corporations has a story about an environmental permit that was breached technically because a water meter had said that they had returned a certain amount of water to the river beyond their daily allowance, but it turned out that the actual water meter, which was new, was incorrect, and so they probably physically never put that much back into the river. However, because there were other issues with monitoring, they did get a visit from the Environment Agency as a result. So accuracy is somewhat a function of the tools that measure it. But I also think that sometimes we would like to put the data in environmental reports in a more usable format for the audience, and that sometimes requires a little bit of taking raw data and putting it into something useful. For example, with energy, you may have measurement of energy over a large space, campus-wide or something like that, and you might want to try and divide that into buildings or certain activities. And it's very hard to do without the proper measurement in place, but it may be worth doing as an estimated process if you feel that in showing that it won't lose the audience, but in showing it at all, that you're giving an idea of for some action to be taken. So accuracy is to be carefully tread upon, but I do think there are cases where educated guesses, as long as they're obvious and explained, may be appropriate for certain reports. The last one there is relativity, which is related to the balloon here. I don't know if anyone has ever heard this statistic. I think it's still on the internet, and it may very well be on our own website still, about the number of Albert Halls filling up with waste from London every minute or hour or whatever it is. Really interesting connection there. If you know the Albert Hall and you can imagine it filling up with waste, then that's great. It's really useful. And I think it gets a point across. However, I'm not sure if everyone in this country really relates to the size of the Albert Hall. And will you be more shocked or less shocked by if it's one Albert Hall every minute and 40 seconds? Does the actual time really have any meaning? Similarly, there was an organization that I think was using purple balloons to simulate carbon. And I think carbon's a really difficult one for us to get our heads around. It visually doesn't strike very much. There's no image associated. I was trying to find a video this morning. I'm not even sure if it was a European video or a UK where it showed a family behaving as normal in a family home for a day, and carbon, I think, was sort of these black bubbles oozing out of every toaster, every stove, and the exhaust of the family car. We know that carbon doesn't look like that in real life. Was it a useful tool? I'm not sure, but I do think there's something to that relativity, but it needs to be careful if you're going to use elephants of waste as an analogy. It might be good to have an elephant around somewhere on campus for that to be useful. So the other content rather than the data in an environmental report is often information. This may or often is the form of so-called soft data, which would be the information from people's opinions and your qualitative information, as it were. I do think it's really important to represent this correctly, and anyone and probably everyone who's better at statistics than me, which would be most of you, I would imagine, I understand how easy it can be to misconstrue the representation of qualitative data without enough information. So talking about opinions but leaving off some of the other answers on a questionnaire, for example, can be a way of showing a trend but not really showing the full story about what the options those people answering the survey had, etc. So I think that's an important element of any environmental report when there is that kind of data to be presented, that some consideration is given to how full the story is and so on, and that the data isn't just showing what it might, what one person may have interpreted as a version, but may not be the full story. Having said that, there's nothing more useful than a short feasibility study, a straw poll, as it were, as an indicator. I just think it needs to be presented as such, and that on occasion we need to say that there are problems potentially with this information. The other one that I've put up there is actions to be taken. Often, and you might be able to relate to this, an environmental report will be about taking action, that its main purpose is either progress on actions taken and highlighting actions yet to be taken, or it may be recommending actions that could be taken. I think the difficulty with this is sometimes not knowing who needs to be taking the action or how those actions can be broken down into further steps before they can be taken and so on. It may not always be appropriate to go to that level of detail. However, I do find it quite interesting, having read many energy and waste action reports, that some are incredibly broad brush in what they describe as an action. Lower your energy use, as opposed to something a little bit more specific, which is test alternative light bulbs and lighting controls in building X or something like that. So something to be keeping in mind about the level of detail, and whether or not the report is to begin the taking of an action, or whether it is progression to identify further detail and so on. I think another issue is about time-sensitive information as well, particularly when you're putting reports in a public domain. For example, legislation that may be forthcoming. If that report is still on the internet 3 years later and is referring to, the first round of the carbon reduction commitment, it goes out of date and may need to be changed or updated or just taken off the internet if it's no longer relevant. And that it may be the case with other information that you're putting up, that there's a time element to it. The last one there is also about action, but it is the call to action. It may be a case that you're writing a progress report for a particular group of people, but it is perhaps part of a larger report that the university does. If there's an opportunity to make a call to action for a more general audience, then my disposition is take that call, put it out there and challenge the readers to do something, whether it be to interact with the authors of the report, or perhaps if you don't want that to be you, then maybe it's the people above you on various committees or whatever the case might be. I do think I have seen enough reports over my career that don't really have a call to action. They've been focused somewhat gleefully, and fair enough, at getting hold of data that might have been very difficult to get hold of and presenting it, but don't actually end with any idea of where to go next or what how the report fits into a larger context. So if there's an opportunity for a call to action, then my advice is to put that in. Slide 9 of 10, the format. I wouldn't normally have mentioned this at all. I have a very interesting anecdote from a colleague who was telling me about RAP, the Waste Resources Action Program. I guess their remit as a government quango, one of the few left standing, is to provide ways of reducing waste. And I think the anecdote was about going to a new supplier conference where people who had been contracted to work with RAP, and there was a supplier, a brand new one, that was there and was doing a presentation with very small printing on the PowerPoint screen, which I hope I haven't done today. And somebody at the back said, "Well, I can't read that; it's too small." And the presenter smiled and said, "Don't worry, I have printed copies for everyone of this presentation." Now, paper can definitely be used sustainably, but it was a presentation about waste reduction, so it was a bit ironic. So it did make me think that format needs to fit the topic somewhat. That doesn't mean we don't need to print these out. Reports are very important to be printed out. I certainly know editing paper needs to be used, but there may be a bit of irony in some of the, like flying to a conference about reducing flights, I suppose. We're always at risk of this happening. So really what is to say about format is it is useful to know where the report is headed right at the beginning, who is going to receive it, what is the best way for that person to receive it, is it interactive and internet-based, will it be electronic or paper-based, will it be placed in the public domain afterwards, and so on. These things may be out of our hands, but it's good to know a little bit about the treatment of the format. And I do think we are moving to a world where reports can be somewhat more interactive, further information in hyperlinks being the very basic, to that the report might actually not be a traditional report, but perhaps an online presentation or webinar even as a possibility. And I think along with all the bells and whistles that go with that, there's a lot more tracking of information that's possible now. So, for example, if any of you do environmental newsletters as part of regular communication with staff and students at a university, it's quite easy to track whether those have been opened, delivered, and so on, and even whether particular articles have been read and for how long, etc. And I do think this kind of information is useful and can set, to some degree, the tone and goal of how we report environmentally, or if anything, to make the next report slightly more improved or stronger in certain areas. So something to consider, particularly as the technology allows us to do much more than it did 10, 15 years ago. Right, well, one more slide. We're almost there. I thought it was important to talk about legacy. I know many of you in various environmental roles will sometimes feel like you're banging your head against the wall, and that all that happens when you write a report is it goes into some big report archive and never gets read. And it's not only difficult and frustrating. We're not creative writers, we're not PR consultants. We're often just trying to provide information about decision making where the environment is related. So we don't want our reports to end up in a room such as in the picture here. And I think that context, knowing as much as we can at the beginning, is important. For example, whether you're writing a one-off report or whether it is part of a tradition, if you like, of putting something in every year at a certain time to fit in with another report, etc. I think that context is important to know, and to challenge where it's maybe not appropriate for the subject matter, either by reporting more frequently if it's a topic matter that needs more frequent reporting, or being able to update between annual reports, etc. It really begs the question if sustainability reports are sustainable, whether the frequency with which we choose to do them, whether the information that is presented in them is being used, is reaching the audience, is providing them with what they need for whatever decisions need to be taken. Very difficult to do, particularly if your focus is getting the report collected and written. So there's an element of feedback and longevity with these to see if what it's doing is what it should be doing. I think as a sort of final point before I close, I can imagine if one or two of those corporations with probably some very well-meaning people saw that Guardian article a year ago and realized that they'd made an error about the sulfur numbers or whatever it might have been in their report, that some of them would be quite annoyed and aghast, thinking, I really want to fix that. It was just an extra number that got in accidentally, or some information I was given that was wrong, and I'd really like to be able to fix it, and otherwise I think it was a very useful report. So for those of you who are either inheriting an annual report that the format has been set for, or whether you're wondering if a mistake has been made by some of the data you've ever been given, let's hope that as we create a sustainable legacy through our environmental reporting, that we have the ability to look backwards as well as forward with this process. Right, well that's all I have to say. I think I'll pass over to Lisa now, who will handle questions.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. That was really, really, really detailed, and hopefully everyone really got something out of that. We'll go to questions first. I'll go to the question that Carl's actually put into the message box. I don't think anyone else can see that one, but if I run through this one first, then I'll go through you all individually. So Carl's actually asking the question, Michael, are there any good examples of environmental reporting that you can recommend reading?
That is a good question. Yes, there are. I haven't done an exhaustive list here. It really depends on what the goal is. I suspected when I sat down to write this report that a lot of you will have had to do CRC, carbon reduction commitment reporting, which is more of a box-ticking exercise. I have a report that I could make available because I happen to be presenting it this Friday for my environmental management students, where I have some web links to some. It's aimed at looking at corporates but trying to distinguish them from each other. So I'd be happy to pass that along. But I do think, as inspiring as other reports can be from organizations, that it really has to fit the context of your own situation, and so it needs to be changed every time. I don't think there's any actual template or anything out there that would fit the bill, because the structures of your universities are going to be different. The issues that you cover might change widely. And again, it depends on the audience, whether visuals are appropriate and how it's conveyed. So I'd be happy to share some resources later this week on that, certainly to inspire. But I don't know that there's one report I've ever seen that has blown me away. I do think those that can play with the combination of the seriousness of which it's been reporting and have an upbeat flavor to it, some positives are amongst the stronger reports that I've ever seen, where it isn't just doom and gloom and negative reporting or just quite academic in style, where it actually is showing, if you like, the people side of some of the environmental activities that I find are really strong reports.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. That was a really good question. If you could make that report available to us, then when we'll add the webinar and the presentation onto the Exchange after this. And if you can send that to us, I guess you want to send it after you've done the presentation, but we'll add that onto the Exchange also at some point, so everyone can have a look at that one. If we go to Alison next, do you have any questions for Michael? Alison, do you have any questions? If you haven't got a microphone, if you just let me know in the message box at the bottom. We'll move on to Emily. Do you have any questions?
Unfortunately, I've missed most of the webinar. I've come into it rather late, but the slides that I did here sounded really useful. So thank you, Michael. It was interesting that. And I would also appreciate seeing that report that you're going to share with us. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Emily. Carl, did you have any other questions you wanted to ask? If you put a message in the message box, that'd be great. And Lynn, do you have anything? No, I think just wait for Lynn to possibly put something in the message box. I think that's it from everybody. I think so. Okay, well, like I said, we'll make everything available on the Exchange, literally hopefully be in the next hour. So if you come back to the Exchange at one point, it'll be there, and we'll also be sending you all a survey just to let us know what you thought. So I'd really appreciate you taking the time to complete that so we can get new topics for more exchanges and continually improve them. So thank you all very much for your time, and I hopefully see you on the next Exchange. And thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.